Theocles, Brutus, and Judas, one Greek, one Roman, and one Jewish. What connects these three men? All three of them are still remembered for their infamous betrayals. Perhaps they had their own reasons. Ephialtes was driven by personal vengeance against the Spartan king Leonidas. Brutus, by the sense of honor and passion to restore the republic by assassinating his friend turned dictator Julius Caesar. And Judas, out of greed and a desire to enrich himself by turning his own teacher, his rabbi, to the Jewish authorities. In doing so, despite their reasons, they crossed a line of loyalty and sanctity that exists in most societies. Their name lives on in infamy and recalled with disdain centuries after they left the pages of history. The most significant betrayer is Judas Iscariot. He was one of the 12 disciples chosen by Jesus Christ to be his intimate followers. In this video, we are going to look at who Judas Iscariot was. Particularly, we will explore what his last name Iscariot means. I will present three views and discuss their possibilities before closing on the most likely explanation for the word Iscariot. We will turn the pages of Bible, ancient Roman historians, biblical geography, and much more to answer these questions around the name Iscariot. Now, let's get to the video. To those of us in the 21st century, Iscariot might sound like a strange last name. In the ancient culture, there were at least few different ways of identifying a person: by their profession or their group association, by their place of origin, by their family names, which is called as patronyms. So let us apply these three situations to Iscariot and see which one makes more sense in view of the evidences. Now let's go to the first possibility. Number one, was Judas a Jewish terrorist? Could Iscariot refer to the Jewish group called the Sicarri? Could Iscariot refer to the Jewish group called the Sicarri? Those who hold this view might argue that his name Iscariot is a derivation from a word Sicarri, the ancient Jewish terrorists and assassins. Take the word Iscariot and move the I after S, and we get Sicariot. Now, this word seemed to be the variant of Sicarri. Let's ask two questions, okay? Who were these Sicarri, and how could Judas be associated with the Sicarri? So the first question, who were the Sicarri? Now, first century Judean province was politically a volatile place. Romans had a lot of difficulty managing this region. There were frequent insurgency movements and resistant groups that fought guerrilla wars against the Roman occupation in Judea. Romans would collectively call all these people as bandits or brigands. The first century Roman historian Josephus, he refers to Jewish liberation movements using the Roman words like zealotoi, lestoi, or sicarioi. So zealotoi means zealots, and lestoi could mean bandits, and sicarioi means the Sicarri. He calls the Sicarri with the meaning of like patriotic bandits in his book, The Jewish Wars or the Wars of the Jews. Let's take a look at a quotation from the Jewish Wars. Book 2, chapter 13.3. When the country was purged of these, there sprang up another sort of robbers in Jerusalem, which were called Sicarri, who slew men in the daytime and in the midst of the city. This they did chiefly at festivals, when they mingled themselves along the multitude and concealed daggers under their garments, with which they stabbed those that were their enemies. When any fell down dead, the murderers became a part of those that had indignation against them, by which means they appeared persons of such reputation that they could by no means be discovered. The first man who was slain by them was Jonathan, the high priest, after whose death many were slain every day. And so Josephus talks about these violent bandits known as Sicarii. Now, the Sicarii were known for the curved daggers that they used. It was called Sicae. So the dagger was called Sicae. Simply, Sicarii meant men who wielded daggers or daggermen. So there were many resistant groups in the first century, but the Sicarii were the most violent and fanatical of the political resistant groups in Judea in first century. According to Josephus, the Jewish Sicarii used short daggers concealed in their clothing to murder their victims, usually at religious festivals, as we have seen in the quote. The fact that Josephus employs the Latin term Sicarii is translated into Greek as Sicarioi suggests that he adopted the term used simply by the Roman forces. He was a Jewish Roman historian, so he adopted the Roman terms to describe the behavior of Sicarii. So in the Wars of the Jews, Josephus presents Sicarii as a specific type of bandits, violent, principled, anti-Roman revolutionary group with a religious motivation. Now, they attacked Romans and their own people, the Jews who collaborated with the Romans. They drew their inspiration from Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, who used violent means to bring cleansing among Israel. Now, Sicarii were likely responsible for the high-profile assassination of Jewish high priest Jonathan in AD 58 at the Jerusalem temple. He was stabbed with daggers and murdered by bandits. And the bandits were never caught. They blended and escaped with the crowd. In such a scenario, is there a surprise that Sicarii were the usual suspect by historians? Like the modern terrorist groups that thrive on religious motives, Sicarii believed that their war against Roman was a holy war. And if they die while resisting the Roman legions, their martyrdom would guarantee them a spot in paradise. So these similarities and much more, Richard A. Horsley from the University of Massachusetts calls the Sicarii the ancient Jewish terrorists. If you are interested to read further about Sicarii, I would recommend a few books for your reference. Now, let's get on with the next question. Was Judas a Sicarii? See, the reason often used to support the claim that Judas was part of the Sicarii comes from his last name, Iscariot. His last name is phonetically similar to Sicarioi. But you need to pay attention, in Greek, it is not the same spelling. Now, the rationale behind this understanding is Jesus had another disciple associated with liberation movement. His name was Simon the Zealot. So he was part of the Zealotoi, the Zealot movement. And so like Simon, Judas must have been associated with the Sicarii movement, the patriotic terrorist bandits. So that's the rationale. So if he was a Sicarii, he must have joined Jesus, believing that Jesus would bring in the Messianic kingdom, a political freedom from Romans that the Sicarii was fighting for. Even in his betrayal of Jesus, it should be seen as an attempt to usher the Messianic kingdom. But when Jesus didn't resist the Romans politically, Judas tried to undo his betrayal, but he failed. So he died out of the guilt of betraying Jesus. And so those who take this view try to justify Judas and his actions. For them, he was a patriotic Jew. He was loyal to the Jewish cause of liberation. Now let's take a look at this whole scenario and assess this situation. Let's see if this is possible. Though it might sound like a possibility, there are questions that we need to answer. At least there are a few issues I would like to highlight. The first one is that it is a very thin argument. The entire theory, the whole Judas was a Sicarri terrorist view, hinges on the interpretation of one word, Iscariot, the phonetic similarity of Iscariot to Sicarri. That's too thin of an explanation or too thin of an argument. The second one I would like to highlight is the issue of chronology. See, the Sicarri movement itself was started much earlier, but they became quite politically active after the time of Judas, much after the time of Judas. Their first high-profile assassination was the murder of the high priest Jonathan in AD 58. And they were very active around the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And these are much after the death of Judas, which happened around AD 30. So it is anachronistic to assume that Judas was a Sicarri. If that is the case, the question still remains, what does Iscariot mean? The next explanation is that Iscariot is connected to a place, perhaps the place of their birth, their hometown, the place of origin. There are two towns in the name of Kerioth in the Bible. One is located within the boundary of the first century Israel. Another one is outside of Israel's boundary, the place that was associated with ancient Moab. Let's go to the second possibility. Was Judas a foreigner? Could Judas come from a town in Moab? Now, there is a consensus that Iscariot must have been associated with a particular place. And it is likely that Iscariot is the transliteration of two Hebrew words, Ish and Kerioth. It means man of Kerioth, a native of Kerioth. The question is, where was Kerioth? Does Bible make any reference to this place called Kerioth? The answer is yes. There are 4 references in the Old Testament about the city of Moab called Kerioth. 3 of the references point to the town's location beyond the Jordan River, east of Jordan in the ancient land of Moab. 2 prophets, Jeremiah and Amos, talked about the judgment of God that would bring destruction to the cities in Moab. One of them was Kerioth. Let's take a note. Let's take a look. Jeremiah 48:24, and on Kerioth, and on Bozrah, and on all the cities of the land of Moab, far or near. Here, Kerioth is identified as one of the cities in the land of Moab. Jeremiah 48:41, Kerioth is taken, and the strongholds are seized, and the heart of the mighty men of Moab at that day shall be as the heart of a woman in her pangs. So here we see, again, Kerioth is associated with Moab. Amos chapter 2, verse 2. But I will send a fire on Moab, and it will devour the palaces of Kerioth. And Moab will die with tumult, with shouting, and with the sound of the trumpet. Here we see Kerioth must have been one of the important cities, and it mentions about the palaces of Kerioth, perhaps an important city. What about Kerioth in the first century? So around 400 BC, the kingdom of Moab collapsed, and it disappeared from the pages of history. It was overrun mostly by settlers from south, the desert tribes. So in the time of the first century, when the events of Jesus' life, crucifixion, resurrection took place, this region came under the Nabatean kingdom that ruled from Petra. Nabateans were North Arabian tribes who occupied the region of Moab. In the first century, they were an ally of the Roman Empire, and their empire was in a very prosperous state. What about Kiryat today? The town of Kiryat in Moab can be identified with the city of Al-Qurayat in Saudi Arabia. You can take a look at Al-Qurayat. This is located in the northwestern side of Saudi Arabia as a border town. Now let's ask this question. Could Judas Iscariot have come from this place? Was Judas a Nabatean or an Arab? Now let's think about this for a moment. One of the ancestors of Jesus and the great-grandmother of King David, Ruth, came from the region of Moab, and she married Boaz. So in this way, Moab has already become part of the Messianic genealogical line. Could this possibly mean that Judas and his ancestors must have come from this ancient region of Moab, which was the first century Nabatea? Now, this would also mean that the composition of Jesus' disciples were international, not just Jews. It's an interesting idea to think about. However, I think the answer should be given in the negative. I'll give you two reasons why I think so. Two reasons. Number one, the name itself, the name Judas itself, from a Hebrew name, Judah, which means praise. Now, that takes us to remember one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the first patriarch of all Jews. It is Judah. If Judas was a foreigner from the region of Moab or Nabatea, he must have had a Nabatean name, which was markedly different from Jewish names. So Nabateans, they use Nabatean Aramaic or Nabatean Arabic. That's different from Hebrew. This is one reason we can say why Judas could not have come from Nabatea. Another reason is related to Jesus' own admission in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. This is what he says. He said, he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Here, Jesus was talking to a Syrophoenician woman. He tells clearly that his first mission was to Israel. Till his death and resurrection, he had very limited dealings with foreigners. He sent his disciples two by two to the towns in Israel. He commanded them, go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Matthew chapter 10, verse 6. With all his emphasis on ministry to his people, the lost sheep of Israel, it is unlikely that he had a foreign disciple. It is unlikely. Those are my two reasons. One is the meaning of the name Judas is actually connected to praise, and it is a Hebrew name. Second one, Jesus himself saw his ministry primarily as a ministry to the Jewish people, the lost sheep of Israel.
The term Iscariot is actually a reference to Judas's hometown. Iscariot is a combination of two words, Ish, which means man, and Karioth, which is the name of the town that Judas was from. What is unique about this town, though, is that it means that Judas was one of the few, if not the only disciple who wasn't from the region of Galilee. So while many, if not all of the other disciples would have grown up knowing one another, Judas was an outsider. But what's more, the place that he was from was not a great place to be from. This is not the kind of place you want to be from. I mean, the Israelites had long-standing tension and conflict with the people of Moab. Moabites attacked them when they were traveling through the wilderness. There were battles between these two peoples. The relationship was so bad that Moabites weren't even allowed to worship in the assembly. Now, while Scripture does not name Judas as a Moabite, he is from this region. He is from a place associated with this conflict.
Brandon Robbins, he has a lot of great videos, Bible videos. And when I looked at this video, his video on Judas, and he definitely thinks that Judas came from this region of Moab. I would like to disagree on this point because the town Kiryat is not the town from Moab, but it was from the southern Judea itself. Let's go to point number 3. A third possibility was Judas A Southerner. Could Iscariot come from his native town in Judea? Now, there is another town that could be identified with Iscariot in southern Judea. Let's take a look at 2 Bible references from the book of Joshua. The first one is Joshua chapter 15:21. Second one is Joshua 15:25. 15:21. The southernmost towns of the tribe of Judah in the Negev toward the boundary of Edom were. So here Joshua is talking about the southern boundary of Judea, or southern boundary of the tribe of Judah before Edomites. Edomites are located here, so the southern boundary must be somewhere around this region. Verse 25, 15:25, he goes on and then mentions Hazor, Hadattah, and then Kerioth Hezron. So we see here the word Kerioth. This we see from 15:21. It is one of the southernmost towns of the tribe of Judah. This makes it very clear that Kerioth was the southernmost boundary town close to Edom, which was located roughly 12 miles south of Hebron and 30 miles south of Jerusalem and 14 miles west of Dead Sea. Today we have an archaeological site called Horvat Kerioth. There we have the remains of the Roman and Byzantine period village. This place is identified as Kerioth, the birthplace of Judas Iscariot. Now, some people might argue that most of the disciples of Jesus came from Galilee and its surroundings. So Judas was perhaps the only outsider. So they derogatorily called him in the name of his town. I think this line of reasoning needs to be clarified. People in the ancient times, the olden days, were called in the name of the towns. Elijah the Tishbite, Mary Magdalene. So Tishbite is a reference to his village, Tishbe. Magdalene is a reference to her town, Magdala. People were called in the name of their geographic regions or hometowns. I think this is the best possible explanation. Let me give you 2 reasons why I think so. The first one, as we noted earlier, the name Judas comes from the Hebrew name Judah, which means praise. Now, we also know that it is the name of their first patriarch, the progenitor of the Jewish tribe, Judah. So if Judas was a Jew, it makes sense for him. If Judas was a Jew coming from the southern region of Judea, it makes perfect sense for him to have the name Judas. You see, those days, the tribal identities were quite strong. It would be impossible for someone from one tribe to assume the name of a person from another tribe. So it must be natural for Judas, because if he had come from the southern region, to have the name of Judah, which was the patriarch, the first patriarch of the Jews. The second reason has to do with the pattern in the names of Jesus' disciples. What do I mean? Now, if we compare the names of Jesus' 12 disciples in Mark, Luke, and Matthew, we can find that there were 2 James and there were 2 Judases. Now, when there were 2 people with the same name or similar name, they had to be distinguished. They were distinguished this way: James, son of Zebedee, and the second James was called as James, son of Alphaeus. In the same way, the first Judas was called Judas, the son of James. So we have Judas, son of James. And then the second Judas was called as Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. That is from John chapter 6, verse 71. Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And later on, this longer name was shortened, and it was called as Judas Iscariot. So as we can see, it refers to his father's and family name, son of Simon Iscariot. So most likely the Iscariot in this name is a reference, also a reference to the native town where Judas and his ancestors must have come from. In closing, we looked at three possibilities. Could Iscariot be related to Sicarri, the Jewish terrorists? Or could Iscariot be a foreigner from the land of Moab? Could Iscariot be a southern Jew? We find the third argument to be more feasible in the light of scriptural evidence and the way the disciples with similar names were distinguished. So here it is. Judas was not a former Jewish terrorist or bandit. He was not a Sicarri. Judas was not a foreigner from the ancient region of Moab or the first century Nabatean kingdom. In John chapter 6, verse 71, Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. His last name, Iscariot, tells us that it was part of his family name, Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. He and his ancestors must have been the natives of Kirioth in southern Judea. Do you agree with this assessment? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Now, if you stayed till the end of this video, may I request you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done already. Our next topic is quite interesting. Was Jesus in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights? What does this phrase, heart of the earth, mean? So please stay tuned and check out the video when it comes out. Once again, thank you very much for your attention. May God bless you all.